So I want to take up now Wimset and Beardsley's second article, sort of part of this pair. The one was the intentional fallacy, which came out in 1946. I think in the last video I said it was 49. That's a mistake. Intentional fallacy comes out in 46, and the affective fallacy comes out in 1949. So these two articles are like bookends, and they are bookends also in a, you could say, in kind of a metaphorical sense about how to interpret poetry, literature, etc. Because the intentional fallacy starts with looking at poetry as a product of intention. So the poetry is the product, is the result, and you're interpreting the result, the effect, by the cause, namely the intention. And now we're shifting to the other side and saying, oh, well, instead of looking at the cause of the poem, let's look at the poem as a cause, and we'll look at the effect of it, how it affects us, right? And they think that's a fallacy too. So let's look at it. So they start off by saying, and again, there's tons going on in this article, and I'm just giving you in this video just a few minutes on the basics of it, but there's a lot that I can't go into, just simply for time reasons. Okay, so two roads, supposedly, that get around all the obstacles that block, good criticism of poetry. Oh, there's two ways around all these obstacles. One will be the sort of this intent, going through intentions, and the other will be going through affectation. So there's two ways to get around all these problems. And in the end, they say, look, these two roads, they really supposedly did get around it, but they didn't. Rather, they lead us astray. These two roads, the first road again being looking at poetry through the intention of who? Of whom? Intention of the author. Wrong way to do it. So the intentional fallacy, as I talked about in the previous video, just abbreviating IF, affective fallacy, abbreviated AF. So the intentional fallacy, what does it do? It confuses the poem and the origins of the poem, right? So it says, oh, instead of the poem, we're going to look at the origins, the authorial intent, all these kinds of things, background and all that. And what do we get in the end? It leads us astray because the poem disappears and we do biography and relativism, right? Because we just do, oh, what the poem means, well, we have to tie it to some kind of biography, and that's an individual life. It's not mine, it's not yours, unless you happen to be the author, or I do. Then the meaning of the poem is relativized to an author's life, and that's it. That's all you can say. So you end up with relativism. If you like that, okay, fine. But they think that's antithetical to the whole idea of criticism, because they think it should be objective. Poems, remember, they're pretty clear about this back in the previous essay on the intentional fallacy. They are public objects, right? They're like moral statements and things like that, and linguistic statements. Those aren't just subjective things. Again, this is up for debate, but let's just understand the position that they're taking is no. Literary works are public objects. They have meaning, and they should be interpreted as public objects that are bearers of meaning. They're not just products of fancy or stimulations for us. No, that's the wrong way to look at it. So again, if you want to hold on to that, you're doing a different game. But Wimset and Beardsley are really taking a very objective, kind of scientific approach. Like, we want a theoretical approach that's going to treat these as these literary works as having real content that can be objectively examined. So we end up, biography and relativism, because you're led away from the poem. You're led into this, the origins of it. Now with the affective fallacy, it's confusing the poem with the results of the poem. It's the other way. And what does that give you? Well, what are the results of the poem? Well, poems make me feel certain ways and think about things, and they're stimulating objects. Well, that's great. But would you interpret, like a piece of science or a piece of mathematics? You might say, well, that was really interesting. That piece of mathematics or physics or chemistry was really interesting. It really stimulated me to think, and it gave me all kinds of images in my mind. But then you say, oh, well, but that's what that it actually means. You'd say, no, there's something that it really means, but I'm just saying that one of the products of reading that math text or that physics text is I was really stimulated to think. But that's not the same thing as that's the meaning of the text. Well, they're doing the same thing now. Like if you with the affective fallacy, you say, oh, it's all about how it affects me. Well, now the poem is going to be confused for its results, and we're going to be led once again away from the poem, says Wimset Beardsley, into impressionism. Like, what are the poem's meanings? The poem's meaning really is what? The impressions that it produces? Well, you can see now we've got, maybe it's not quite as bad for relativism, but because other people could just say, well, it means this to me, or they talk about the images or whatever. So lots of people would be able to say what the poem means. So it's a little bit more open than this one, but it's still relativism because it's just relative to my feelings. And then we can't really, and you think about it, when you really start unpacking things in terms of feelings, which, okay, maybe it works or whatever, but you're really not communicating in the same way as if you unpack things in terms of having their own meaning that we all participate in. And that's their point, is that this thing here, this affective fallacy, is tied to a particular movement in philosophy, or it relates to, which was called emotivism at the time. And it's still called emotivism today. There's various forms that are still around. It's not as popular as it was, but emotivism was basically a psychological style critique of not necessarily literary works, but morality. And it was largely associated with thinkers like A.J. Ayer and the positivist movement, right? Although it's debatable if it was really a big movement. But logical empiricism, logical positivism had a certain view of ethics, that ethical statements weren't really statements like, you know, the cat is on the mat, or the book is on the table. They weren't really mathematical statements, so they're not physical-like statements that you can investigate. They're not mathematical statements. Their moral statements are kind of odd constructions, but they unpack them in terms of emotions. So emotivism would take, again, this is a very simple version of it. There are more sophisticated versions. But emotivism would say something like, murder is wrong. It really doesn't unpack it in terms of meaning. It wouldn't say true or false, right? Because true or false statements tend, arguably are statements of matters of fact, the way the world is arranged. So, this board is white. That's a statement about the arrangement of a particular set of objects in the world. And it can be true or false, right? If I were to take a paintbrush and paint it blue, then this board is white would no longer be true. It's true now, but it could change. No problems with that. But moral statements aren't like that, right? Moral statements don't have, they basically don't have truth values, right? They're not true false. They're not statements. They're not mathematical statements. What are they? Well, really, when you unpack them, according to emotivism, you don't get true or false or meanings or anything like that. They're just really to be unpacked in terms of negative feelings. So if I say something like, I think murder is wrong, or I think or I believe murder is wrong, what's really going on in this murder is wrong? Those are really my negative feelings. So another way that I could, shall we say, express this pseudo quasi statement, I think that murder is wrong, I could just go, ugh, murder. Like express my revulsion, is because that's basically what moral statements are. Or if I said, charity is good, you should give money to the poor or whatever. So things that would be positive expressions of morality would in turn be me going, yay for giving money to the poor, something like that. So these moral statements are really unpacked in terms of our deep emotions. And many think, they go on to talk about in the essay, Wimset and Beardsley go on to talk about how many authors, like from Plato and Aristotle on down, have, from time to time lapsed into this, emotive version of ethics as applied to literature, giving this affective fallacy. Like, for instance, Aristotle's notion of a catharsis, right? The meaning is, as we think about Aristotle in the Poetics, when he talks about, what's really important is this notion of catharsis. Now, does he really say it's the meaning? But he definitely, that's arguable. But what they're saying is that that's an example of, what's really important, or part of literary criticism would be the effect that it produces in the individual. So this catharsis that Aristotle talks about is kind of an example, an early example of a version of the affective fallacy. All right, so but then they go on. Okay, well, in addition to these thinkers in history that have done this, what's really the main problem here? Well, it's the same as what they said in the previous article on the intentional fallacy. First off, intentions they're private. You can't know my intentions. I can't really know yours. I can report about my intentions, but you can't experience my intentions because they're inevitably subjective entities. They say feelings are very much like that. If you tie your literary criticism really to results, right, the feelings in the readers and whatnot, you get this impressionism, but you're talking about feelings. And they're not saying that feelings are unimportant, but they're just saying you can't, they're in the end, whatever they really are, they're vague. And they borrow a little bit from a great German idealist of the 19th century, Hegel, who said, when you think about, these feelings, feelings are the most subjective affectations of the self. In other words, there's all kinds of affectations, that, like effects or ways of behavior or whatever, that can be at least partly public. But a feeling is a really subjective, internal kind of mental state, right? It's a very private thing. And, many times some people, really show their feelings right through their bodily actions, fine. But really, in the end, feelings are, as Hegel, and they're picking up on Hegel's view, they're very private, right? And they're so private that they abstract from so many things in the world, even our bodily movements and behavior, that Hegel says they're amongst the most abstract things around. Like, a feeling is so intensely subjective and limited to basically the personal experience that no one else experiences. What could be more abstract than that, right? So in that sense, they say, and also, sometimes if you try to articulate a feeling, it can be extraordinarily difficult to do it. They're often vague. Right? Like, oh yeah, like I'm angry. Well, what do you mean by angry? What are you angry about? Often, we may feel an emotion or a feeling quite intensely. It's a very raw power, but it's not always easy to explain it, or we don't really know these kinds of bodily states. So even the idea of picking up on bodily states, yeah, they're private and they're personal and they're intense, but they too can be kind of, you're not sure about how you're feeling about something. We can be confused about our own feelings, etc., etc. So you got this. They're private, they're vague, they're abstract, they're irrefutable. They're not objects that we can talk about in public. They're not in the public space, just like intentions are. So again, there's a little bit of, shall we say, a little bit of verificationism in Wimset and Beardsley's views. Like, you can't put feelings out on the table so we can examine them. We just have to rely on reports of them. So they're not really accessible to anybody. They're vague even to the holder of them. They're irrefutable. And so in the end, it's not a great idea to base criticism if you, again, have this presupposition that criticism should be about the public object, the poem. Now we're talking about feelings. Where'd the poem go? Right? So in the first one, where'd the poem go? We're talking about intentions and author biography. Where did the poem go? Now it's, where did the poem go? We're talking about feelings and relative to feelings, and maybe I got to talk about, my personal history. Now we're doing biography. Where did the poem go? So in both of these, again, these two roads, it looks, like we were going to get somewhere, but then all of a sudden we were led astray and we left the poem, right? Where'd the poem go? We're not talking about that anymore. We're talking about intentions and feelings. That's not poetry. That's something else. It might be linked causally in some way, but again, don't confuse causes and effects and things like that. So if the poem is the effect of the cause, the intention, fine. But the poem is the effect. Okay, go to the effect, the poem. But now the poem is the cause of feelings in readers, and then you go off and you confuse again, and you go off and start talking about the effects. You've lost the poem again. All right. So they they basically say that even this all this vividness and things that we talk about, what can we really say about that? Not much. Vivid, okay. So you have vivid images. There's nothing. There's really nowhere to go with this. And so in that sense, and also think about it. Think about this. A lot of people will say, you know what, I really thought that poem was great because it or that novel, or it left a lot to the imagination. We often say that. It was very stimulating. It left a lot to the imagination. And then if you say, okay, so that was a good thing that it did that, right? Yeah, but leaving a lot to the imagination in and of itself isn't necessarily a good thing. That's a result. So what you want to look for is, what was it in the poem that enabled you to have the experience of that left a lot to the imagination and that stimulated me. So what is in the poem? What's the structure or the cognitive content or whatever? It's that sort of intrinsic literary sort of aspects of the poem that leads to you saying something like, it made me think, or whatever. But so again, both of these, I think what both of these are just simply saying is that when we're trying to play critic, we're not all that different from basically a scientist or a researcher looking at a public object and saying, again, as Socrates would say, what is it and what's going on inside it, as opposed to just immediately jumping to what's going on in us, or either or the author that wrote it or the people that read it. So instead of authors and so avoiding jumping into talking about authors and readers and then abandoning the poem, that's not criticism. Criticism is supposed to get us out of the way, concentrate again on the poem in and of itself, or the literary work in and of itself, because that's truly where the interesting stuff, according to Wimset and Beardsley, where it lies. Okay, so that's about all I'm going to say. Again, this paper has a lot more stuff going on in it, but that's roughly what they're after in outline. See you next video.